This weekend, we've got some work to do because we're finishing up a series that we've been in over the last month or so called Stop Believing. And really at the core of what we're doing throughout this conversation in this series that we've been in, we're taking a look at our belief systems, our beliefs, the things that we think are true. Because we know at our core that our beliefs are actually really powerful because our beliefs drive our behaviors. In fact, here's what we said this week in your notes as we get into the conversation. What we believe shapes how we live. That what we believe shapes how we live. Your beliefs about how life is supposed to go shape the decisions that you make, and your decisions shape your actions, and your actions in part shape the way that your whole life is going to look. So it begs the question that we ask internally in our own life, introspectively, do I really believe the right things? Like, are there things in my life that have wiggled their way into my belief system that maybe shouldn't be there to begin with? I think you owe it to yourself to make sure you're actually believing the right things about how life goes. And if you're a Christian, I actually think it's even more important than that. I don't just think you owe it to yourself. At the end of the day, as Christians, we're supposed to reflect Christ to the world around us. Our lives are supposed to reflect Jesus to the world. So the question is not for us as Christians, do I just believe the right things generally about life? But at the end of the day, do I actually believe things in my life that are biblical? Like, do I believe the things that God would say are truth about how life goes? Because my beliefs drive my behaviors, and that ultimately shapes my life. I hope that you found this series really helpful. If you've missed any of the weeks, I would really encourage you to go back. Each week's kind of been a standalone thing as we've navigated different topics. Now, like I said, we got some work to do this weekend, and to be honest, I think the conversation that we're going to be in and have to wrap up this series is one that will be really, really impactful for you, and it's one that, to be fair, is really near and dear to my heart, especially as it relates to this church. I am a guy who loves to get obsessed with things. If you're in my family, especially if you're my wife, you know that that's true about me. I love to get obsessed with things. I love to start new hobbies. I love to go down new ventures. And I've done a bunch of those and gotten obsessed with different things over the years. But my senior year of college, and maybe even a little bit the summer after my graduation of college, I got obsessed with something that is super random. And if you don't really know me like super, super well, this is going to catch you off guard. I became obsessed with chiropractic care. Don't know why. I wasn't obsessed with like going to the chiropractor. I was obsessed with chiropractic care as a genre, as a topic. I found it very fascinating that there was a whole group of people on one side of the aisle that would say chiropractic care is like game-changing and it affects every area of your life. And then there's other people on the other side of the aisle that would say, actually, there's like no scientific evidence that chiropractic care does anything for you. But my favorite part of chiropractic care was the subgenre of YouTube channels that you can find where people get their spines adjusted. Incredible. If you didn't know that exists, I would really encourage you to go look up chiropractic adjustments on YouTube. There's actually a name for people who like that subgenre of video on YouTube. They're called crack addicts. And I was like, if that's what they're called, then call me that, because I was all about it. And for me, though, at that point in my life, it wasn't just that I liked the concept of chiropractic care. I actually told myself that potentially chiropractic care was one of the things that would shape like the career path for me. Like, it was going to be a solidifying thing to kind of rest my heart on, hey, maybe this is the path that God would have in store for my life. Now, I've had a bunch of those different obsessions over the years. I've gone down a bunch of those rabbit holes. I've sustained a lot of those obsessions over the years. And you've probably had some of those things in your life that you've started and really contemplated as well. And there's a mindset that we carry with us when we get into those new ventures or start those new things. And here's the mindset: that our initial approach to new things is often idealistic. Our initial approach to new things is often idealistic. We like to think that the thing we're about to step into, whether it's the first time we're engaging it or maybe the first time in a while that we're engaging it, is going to solve all the problems in our life. So for me, chiropractic care wasn't just like this thing that I liked. It was the thing that was going to solidify my career path going down the road. And ultimately, it wasn't, but that's okay. That's what I thought about it at the beginning. This is why when we go on vacation, no matter how many times we've gone on vacation and it hasn't gone great, the next vacation is going to be an awesome vacation. The next vacation, our kids are going to behave, the weather's going to be great, Disney's not going to be too crowded. Because we have idealistic expectations about the new things that we step into. we don't just do it about superficial things. We do this about maybe more serious things in our life. This is why when we start new jobs, we like to believe that at the end of the day, this new job is actually going to solve all the problems that my old job had. I'm going to feel like I'm well cared for, I'm well compensated, I'm going to feel like my boss actually recognizes the work that I do, I'm going to feel like I actually accomplish a lot, but I don't have to work too hard. This new job is going to be great. For many of us, this is how marriage starts. This is so unfair, by the way, about marriage. We start marriage, we get married, and then we go on a honeymoon to begin our marriage. It's not fair because you get married and then you go spend a week and a half on a beach somewhere and everybody's serving you and you're spending way more money than you'll ever spend in the rest of your marriage on your marriage. And we build our expectations around what our whole marriage is going to look like based off of a week in paradise. It's just what we do. We have idealistic expectations when we start new things. Now, here's the danger with that. The danger with that is that we know that when we get into new stuff or when we get down the road and we've been in our job for a little while or we've been married for a little while or we're on day 5 of the week-long vacation, we know that there is nothing ideal. There is no such thing as an ideal vacation or an ideal job or an ideal marriage because perfect doesn't exist. You get into the day 5 of your vacation and you realize, the same kids that I've had that have been arguing every day for the last 3 months are the same kids we brought with us on this vacation. and we build our expectations that things are going to be ideal. But then we experience them and we realize, this isn't as ideal as I thought it was going to be. For some of us, we get 6 months, a year into our job, and we thought that job was going to solve all the problems. But then we realize this job's got a lot of problems in and of itself. And here's what happens to us. I put it in your notes this way, that if we aren't realistic, our expectations will lead to disappointment. If we aren't realistic, our expectations will ultimately lead us to disappointment. If all the expectations that we've built up in our mind about the thing that we're going to engage are built off of idealism and not realism, then we are setting ourselves up to be disappointed because we know ideal doesn't actually exist. We live in a real world, not an ideal world. I heard someone say earlier this week that unrealistic expectations equal premeditated disappointment. If you go into a new thing and you've built all your expectations on that thing about what is the ideal version in my mind about how this thing goes, you have pre-decided that at some point you're going to be disappointed. You've pre-decided that at some point your expectations are not going to be met and you're going to be let down. Now, you might ask, Daniel, why do you care so much about disappointment? Why do you care so much about expectations? Because I know something and you know something about people who are disappointed. People who have expectations that aren't met, they get disappointed. And here's what we know about people who are disappointed. Ultimately, that disappointment leads to disinterest in the thing. And it's no longer that an expectation wasn't met. Now it becomes, I don't know if this thing that I once thought was good for my life is actually as good for me as I thought it was. And then that disinterest turns into disengagement. And it's now no longer that I was just disappointed or just disinterested. Now I hardly engage that thing at all. This is why on average, most people start a new job every 2 years because we go through this cycle. We go through the cycle of, I had expectations, my expectations weren't met, I got disappointed, that disappointment leads to disinterest, and then that disappointment leads to disengagement. Some of us, that's exactly where we're at in marriage. We built our expectations off the ideal version of something that lived in our mind. Then our spouse didn't measure up to all the expectations we had. We got disinterested, and now we're disengaged. And some of us are on our second, third, fourth marriage because of that cycle right there. Now, I've been on staff here at Grace for 5 years. I've been preaching for a couple of years now. I've led our young adult ministry called The Commons for about 4 years. And if you're asking the question, Daniel, what does this have anything to do with church? I want to just fill in the dots for you. There is one place that as a staff member here at Grace Fellowship, I see the cycle of disappointment leading to disengagement maybe more than any other place. And that's with our relationship with church. With church. We do this with church. This is the cycle that we go down. We build expectations of how church is supposed to go in our mind, and then those expectations aren't met, and we get disappointed. And that disappointment ultimately leads us to disengagement. I want to tell you a story, and to be honest, some of you are probably going to know this story better than I do, but I think it'll be fun, so I'm going to tell you this story. Once upon a time, it's that kind of story. Once upon a time, there was a little girl named Goldilocks. Told you might be familiar with the story. Goldilocks is going through the woods one day, and she finds a cabin in the woods. And Goldilocks is a brave girl, so she goes into the cabin in the woods, and nobody's in there. But she finds a meal sitting ready for her on the table. So she goes up, she grabs the first bowl of porridge, she eats it, and she's like, I know this was free, but this bowl of porridge is too hot. It's too hot. So she moves on to the next bowl of porridge. She grabs it, she eats it, she says, this bowl of porridge is too cold. Then she finds a third bowl, and she goes up to the third bowl, she eats it, and she says, this bowl of porridge is just right. Just right. And then because she's a brave girl, she felt a little tired, so she went and she found a bedroom. She walked into the bedroom and sat on the bed, in the first bed, and she said, you know what, this bed is too hard. Climbed into another bed, she said, this bed is too soft. Then she climbed into the third bed, she said, this bed is just right. And I don't just tell you that story for no reason. I tell you that story because I actually think that that's how a lot of us treat church. We go to a church, we have a local church experience, and we walk in, we experience maybe a gathering like this one, or we go to a small group or some type of an event put on by a church, and we fill in the blanks, and we say, this church is whatever. And we go to another church. This church is whatever. And we believe that the just right church will find someday. We believe that the Goldilocks church exists. In fact, here's how I said it in your notes. We believe that the right church will be just right. We believe that the right church will be just right. That the right church is out there, I just need to find it. I need to find the right church. And when I find the right church will preach the right way, they'll do worship the right way, the community that they'll plug me into will be just right. And here's what happens. For so many young adults, this is the thing that they believe. They don't believe just that the right church will be just right. They believe that the right church will have the right person, and that right person will be just right for them, and they'll find their spouse at the right church. And I make fun of the young adults for that all the time. But it's an expectation that some of us carry with us, that the right church will be just right. The right church will have the right leaders, and they'll be awesome people. They'll do volunteering the right way. They'll do giving the right way. At the right church, everyone will treat me the right way. They'll do kids ministry the right way, and everything I've been looking for in a church will be satisfied. Every expectation that I have, if I find the right church will meet all those expectations. And then we go to church, and we walk into a local church. And we experience a weekend service, or we experience life and community at a local church. And it's not what we expected. The right church, we find out pretty quickly, hold on. I had all these expectations about how church was going to go, but now I've experienced church for a little while, and I've got some expectations that went unmet, and now I'm disappointed. The right church, I went to the right church, I thought was the right church, but now they do some weird stuff, and I'm not so sure that right church is actually the right church for me. I was at the right church, or so I thought. I thought it was going to be a great church. I thought all my expectations were going to be met, and then someone said something inappropriate to one of my kids. And then my kids came back from camp. Come on, this might be real for you. Your kid comes back from Momentum and tells you that all week one of the boys in his group bullied him, and his leaders did nothing about it. We have the expectation that the right church is out there. I just got to go find it. And if I find the right church, it'll be just right. And maybe deep down in our heart, what we actually believe is that the right church will be perfect. That at the right church, every expectation I have will be met. At the right church, there won't be relational tension. At the right church, I'll be treated the right way. But come on. If we build all of our expectations on church around the ideal version of what we think should exist in our mind, we are setting ourselves up for disappointment. And here's why this conversation is so near and dear to my heart. Because I've seen this cycle play out for so many people in our church, for so many young adults, for so many adults, for so many different people of all ages. They come to Grace Fellowship. They believe, man, this is a good church. Maybe this is the right church for me. I love the preaching. I love the worship. It seems like everything's done really well. And then they spend some time here, 6 months in, a year in, 2 years in, 3 years in, and they realize, Grace Fellowship is a great church, but it's not a perfect church. And I've had some disappointment. And the reason this is so near and dear to my heart is because I've had enough conversations with people that that's their reality in their life. And ultimately, that disappointment that shows up leads to disengagement. And they leave the church. And then they go and find another church. And they believe that at that church, it'll be just right. And the cycle continues because there is no such thing as an ideal church. There is no such thing as a perfect church. And just as an aside, this is some of the reason that maybe if you're not a Christian, this is why some of us don't engage church at all. Because you look around and you're like, man, all I see is imperfect churches. All I see are people and places at churches that mess up, institutions that are wrong, people who can't seem to get their act together and get it right. But listen to me. If our expectation is that the perfect church is out there, the just right church is out there, I just need to go find it, we are setting ourselves up for disappointment. And hear me clearly, we are believing something that the Bible doesn't teach. If you're a Christian and you think the perfect church exists, you think the perfect church is out there, you just need to find it, you have a wrong view of church according to the Bible. And that's what we're gonna dive into this weekend. So we're gonna dive into a passage of scripture that I think will be really helpful for us as we navigate this conversation. Ephesians chapter 4 is where we're gonna be. So if you have a Bible or you have your phone, I would encourage you to turn it on. If you don't, it'll be up on the screen. Ephesians 4 is a really good passage for this conversation because it's written by a guy named Paul. And if you know anything about the New Testament or the Bible, Paul actually wrote a ton of the New Testament. And I want to give you a little bio on who Paul was. Paul was a follower of Jesus. And Paul, because he wrote so much of the New Testament, he actually wrote so much of the New Testament because he was kind of like a church expert. He went around and he traveled to a bunch of different churches. He actually kind of functioned like a church consultant in the New Testament. You see him going and traveling to a bunch of churches, encouraging them, teaching them, training them, correcting them when necessary, encouraging them when appropriate. And he wrote this letter called Ephesians to a church in Rome. And that church is doing some things right, but Paul is ultimately training them and coaching them on what they should expect when they engage in church. So as we navigate this letter, it's really, really important that we understand Paul is writing this letter to a church, and churches are made up of Christians. Christians make up the church, and the local body of believers is called a local church. And so if Paul's writing to them, explaining to them, coaching them, training them on what they should expect when they go to a local church, we should perk up and listen because it has everything to do with this conversation. Here's how it starts in chapter 4, verse 1. As a prisoner for the Lord, then I, Paul, urge you to live a life worthy of the calling you've received. I, Paul, urge you to live a life worthy of the call that you have received. Now, we're just going to pause right here because I actually think this is really interesting. Paul is saying something that I want us to notice. Paul is saying that if you are a church goer, if you are a Christian, there is a call on your life. There is an expectation that has been set by God. There is a standard for how you and I as Christians should live and how we should engage the local church. And I think what we need to pay attention to is Paul is urging people to make sure that their life measures up to that standard. What does that mean? It means that it's possible for us as Christians and us as a local church to have a standard on our life that we are not currently living up to. It means that we need to actually work hard to make sure we look the way that God wants the local church and individual Christians to look. We have to make sure that we measure up to the standard, which is interesting because I think if Paul was saying that the perfect church is out there and that's an okay belief to have, then he wouldn't say live a life worthy of the call. I think what he would say is, hey, go find a body of believers where they don't even have to try too hard, they're already measuring up to the standard. But instead, he says, actually, if you're going to measure up to the standard, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And then he goes on and he continues by saying this: be completely humble and gentle, be patient, be bearing with one another in love. This is interesting. Because if the perfect church existed, if there was such thing as a perfect church, why would Paul give us all these characteristics that should mark our lives as we engage church? Imagine with me, you were going to meet one of my cousins. Not picking on any of my cousins, but let's say you were going to meet one of them and you had never met him before and you came to me, you said, Daniel, is there anything I should know about your cousin? I'm gonna go have lunch with them. And all I said back to you was, oh, you're gonna have lunch with my cousin? Be patient, be patient. Oh, you're gonna go have lunch with them? Okay, yeah, be gentle, be gentle. Oh, you're gonna have lunch with them? Oh, bear with them, you'll get through it. That's real for a lot of our family members, I'm just saying. But what would the expectation be if that's how I responded to you? The expectation would be that if you're gonna go have lunch with one of my family members and I tell you to make sure these characteristics are true of your life, you're gonna expect that you're gonna have to use those characteristics during that lunch. You're gonna expect that there are gonna be times in that conversation you're gonna have to be patient. You're gonna have to be gentle. You're gonna have to bear with them and get through it. What is Paul saying about church? He is saying that we should expect that we will have to practice these characteristics at some point in our relationship with a local church. Which makes absolutely no sense if really what we believe is that the perfect church is out there, we just need to go find it. Because if the perfect church existed, then why would I ever need to demonstrate these characteristics? I just can leave and go find another one where everybody else is fine with me and I'm good with them and I never have to have any relational tension at all. Paul says the expectation for us when we engage church is that we will have to use some of these characteristics. He goes on to say this. He says, make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. What is the unity of the Spirit? Unity of the Spirit is unity amongst everyone who has the Spirit. Theologically speaking, the people who have the Spirit of God indwelling inside them are Christians. And what do Christians make up? The church. And he says, make every effort to keep the unity. That going to church, there are going to be times where you're tempted to not fight for unity. And that unity is not easy. You and I have to make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit. Now, Paul gives us the reason why, as Christians, we should be so concerned with keeping the unity of the Spirit in the next verse. It goes on to say this in verse 4. There is one body, one church, one body, one church, and one Spirit, just as you were called, to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, and one God, Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all. Paul says the reason that church people should care so much about being unified is because the God they reflect is a unified God. The God that we serve as Christians, come on, listen to me. The God that Grace Fellowship exists to push his mission forward. The God who has gifted Grace Fellowship, the God who has given us a mission to complete as a local church, is a unified God. He is one God. There is no tension within the Trinity that is our God that we serve. And as Christians, we should be very, very diligent to make every effort to make sure we keep unity, that we fight for unity, that the characteristics and the morals of our life are aligned in such a way that we reflect the one God that we serve. And that God didn't just leave us out to dry in this fight for unity. He actually goes on and he says that he gifts us in some specific ways. So Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, the teachers, pastors and teachers, sometimes translated as shepherds and teachers, to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ might be built up until we all reach unity in the faith and in the knowledge of the Son of God, and until we become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. The one God that we serve gave us gifts, gave the local church gifts. And some of the gifts that God gave to the local church are the apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, and teachers. These are the people who lead us. These are the people who call us forward. They're the people who call out our sin. These are the people who give us structure and guide rails in our life. They coach us, they correct us, they train us, they care for us. And God has given us those people to make sure that we fight for unity in the church, to make sure that our expectations are aligned about what we should experience at church, to make sure that our characters and our morals line up with what God would call church people to have in their life. I think it's important to call this out before we move on to the next verse. It says, until we reach unity. That's interesting. Until we reach unity, until we reach the fullness of knowledge, until we become mature, meaning that there is a maturity level, there is a fullness level, there is a unity level that right now the church does not quite experience yet. And we should make it our expectation that as church people, as Christians, we work to move the church more towards unity and maturity. The perfect church does not yet exist, but it's on its way there. And then it goes on to say this: then we will no longer be infants tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful schemes. if we don't work to make sure the church is being built up, if Christians don't work hard to make sure that the church is being unified and becoming more and more mature, then ultimately we will stay immature. And that the people who come in and try and cause dissension within the church and try to crumble down the church will win and have their day. But as Christians, we should make every effort to keep the unity and to mature the church towards what God wants it to. And then it wraps up in verse 15. Instead, speaking the truth in love. This is what his call on our life as Christians is supposed to be, that as we engage church and church people, we would speak the truth in love. Now, there's two parts to this phrase. There's speaking the truth, and there's the love part. And some of us, we hear that phrase and we're like, I'm all about speaking the truth. I love going up to people and telling them the things that they're doing wrong in their life. It's like really my favorite conversation to go up and explain to someone how they're wrong and how I should be able to correct them. There are others of us, we don't like the speaking the truth part, we like the love part. We're like, come on, bring everybody in. I'm not gonna judge, I'm not gonna be too hard. It's gonna be great, I'm gonna be calm, I'm gonna be gentle. I will bring the love. Paul's call to those of us who are church people is that as it relates to the church being matured, the church growing and building itself up, part of our job is that we would do both of those things. We would say the hard things and speak the truth, and we would do it in a loving way. We don't get to pick and choose whatever our bias is. We as Christians speak the truth in love always, every time. And then it goes on to say this: we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of him who is the head, that is Christ. From him, the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love. There is an expectation that the church of Jesus should be moving forward and becoming more mature. But get this, you and I have a part to play. And the church moving forward and becoming more mature and becoming better and better and trying to attain to what God's call for the church is on our life does not happen unless we get the last few words right. It says this as it ends: as each part does its work. If we're going to make sure that the church of Jesus becomes what God's desire is for it, we got to work hard to get there. We have a part to play in the progress of God's church being built up and moving forward. So many of us, what we believe at our core is that the perfect church is out there and I just need to find it. But listen to me, finding the perfect church is not a factor of walking into the right building on a Sunday morning. You could spend your entire life going to different church every single weekend, and listen to me clearly, you will never find a perfect church. You will never find a church that measures up to all the expectations that you might have. You will never find a church that will never disappoint you. Why? Because the perfect church does not yet exist. And we need to stop believing that the perfect church is out there. And what we actually need to do is start believing this about the perfect church. Here's how I said it in your notes: that the perfect church is a work in progress. We need to start believing that the perfect church is a work in progress. I think another way you could say it is, we're not there yet, but we're on our way there. The church of God is moving forward and progressing in the world, but we have not quite attained what God would call us to. Daniel, is this phrase just a cop-out so that churches can be bad? Is this phrase just a cop-out so that churches can do whatever they want and they can mess up and excuse it all away because nobody's perfect? No. Not at all. In fact, there's an expectation. Do not forget, God has placed an expectation on our life. God has placed an expectation on the local church. And some of us, we hear that phrase, and all we can think about is Grace Fellowship. And listen to me. Grace Fellowship is a great church. It is. It's a great church. I've grown up here. 26 years of my life I've spent here at Grace Fellowship. Been on staff now for 5 years. It's an incredible church. Grace Fellowship's a great church, but it's not a perfect church. I've seen its warts. I've seen the things that have gone on at this church over the years. There's sometimes relational tension happens. Sometimes there's dysfunction. And while Grace Fellowship is not a perfect church, it's a great church. The leaders of this church are not perfect people. Our elders are not perfect people. I, as a preacher, stand up here whenever I get to the opportunity to preach, and I, more than anybody on planet Earth, know that I am not a perfect person. Pastor Keith, not a perfect person. He's a great man, not a perfect man. The leaders of our church, great people, not perfect people. So we, as we walk into a local church, and those of us who call Grace Fellowship home, we should make sure we believe that the perfect church is a work in progress. This is not an excuse for us to get things wrong. This is a call on our life to recognize that there is work to be done in the local church. And the answer when dysfunction or disappointment shows up is not to leave and go believe that I can find another perfect church somewhere else. It's to be part of the progress. God's call on our life is that we would do the work to make sure the church is maturing. God certainly has a part to play in that, and we certainly have a part to play in that. Now, when it comes to our work in making sure the church is progressing, I actually have a handful of phrases that I want to give to us, and we'll work through these kind of quickly as we go through it. But I want it to be really clear. So these phrases are not going to be clever in any way. I just want them to be clear. But they have everything to do with the work that is our responsibility as we engage the local church. One of the jobs that we are to have as we engage the local church, recognizing that the perfect church is a work in progress, is this job right here. We need to make sure, as individuals in the church, that we respond appropriately to relational tension. Respond appropriately to relational tensions. What did Paul tell us at the beginning of the passage? He says, as you engage church, make every effort to keep the unity. And sometimes keeping the unity means that you have to be gentle. Sometimes it means you have to be patient. Sometimes it means that you have to speak the truth in love. But here's what we have to believe. Come on, please hear me when I say this. If you engage church for any length of time, there will be relational tensions. If you engage church and you do more than just coming in, grabbing your coffee and sitting down, and you actually buckle in and engage that community, there will be relational tensions that show up in your life. In God's call, and he says the work that we are responsible for is to make sure that we respond appropriately when those relational tensions show up. I've got a 2-year-old son, and when we had Abe, he was... this isn't actually a story about Abe, this is a story about the expectations. I was gonna say he was born when we had him. So, he was born when we had him. He was a newborn when he came out. And as people were talking to us about like what we should expect, sometimes, to be honest, guys, we did this, guys would come up to me and say, oh dude, the diapers, man, the diapers stink. It's brutal. You love him now, but just wait until you're changing 15 diapers a day. And they would complain about it, and they would expect me to complain about it. And there was a lot of times, trust me, believe me, I wanted to complain about it. But here's what I knew. I knew that being a young dad, being a parent, we were gonna have to change some diapers. That if Abe's life was gonna continue to go on in the way that we wanted it to go on, we were gonna have to take care of him and change his diapers. I knew that when we signed up to have a kid, we were gonna change some diapers. Listen to me, when you sign up to go to church, it'll get messy sometimes. When you go to church and you sit in a room with thousands of people and you engage in a community life group, or you go to grace group, or you go to Bible study, or you have some friendships and develop some relationships there, listen to me, it's gonna get messy sometimes. There's gonna be relational tension. And we need to stop buying the lie that is, if relational tension shows up, it's not good anymore. And that if relational tension shows up, the proper response is to just, be quiet and leave. Not true. But come on, hear me clearly. Expecting dysfunction, expecting relational tension is not the same thing as excusing dysfunction or excusing relational tension. The proper response is not, these people did something wrong to me, these people hurt me, I'll just wipe it under the rug and move on. God's call for our life is that we would respond appropriately when relational tension shows up. And if you go to church long enough, it's gonna show up. So I respond appropriately. Sometimes that means I have to make sure I demonstrate those characteristics that Paul was talking about. I'm gentle and I'm humble and I'm patient and I bear with people because I know they're gonna let me down. Other times it means that we speak the truth in love, and we speak the truth and we say the hard things, we say how someone hurt us, and we do it in a loving way. But there is very rare circumstances where dysfunction or relational tension shows up and we're not called to do anything about it. We have to respond appropriately because the perfect church is a work in progress, and you and I have a part to play in that progress. Part of our work is making sure we respond appropriately when relational tension shows up. The next thing that I think is our job as people who go to a church and engage a church is this phrase here. One of our jobs is to make sure that we manage our preferences with the priority of unity. That we manage our preferences with the priority of unity. What does that mean? Well, when you get a bunch of people in a room together, everybody's gonna have a preference about how something should go. I've heard, I won't make this joke, I've heard bad things about committees. When you put a committee in charge of planning something, you don't ever get what you actually set out to plan because everybody spoke their word and everybody said what they wanted to do. And the same thing happens in church. We all come into a room, we go into a grace group, we go into an environment, and we all have a preference about how something should go. We all have ways that we would prefer something to play out. And hear me clearly, there are more opinions about how church should go today than there ever have been before. You can go find 80 million podcasts on Spotify right now that will all give you different preferences about how church should go. And when they give you those preferences, they say, this is how church is supposed to be done. And then they list off their preferences. All of us have different preferences. Here's some that I've heard over the years. Do I dress up to go to church or do I not dress up to go to church? Should I go to a big church or should I go to a small church? How should your church preach? Should there be lights on the stage? No lights on the stage. Should the music be really loud? Should the music not be really loud? Should we sing hymns? Should we not sing hymns? How many hymns should we sing? How many hymns should we not sing? Is the preaching topical or expository? How big should my small group be? Are there kids that are allowed to be in the auditorium or not? Or are there kids always in the auditorium? And by the way, do we call it an auditorium or do we call it a sanctuary? Or if you go to Grace Fellowship, do we call it the main for some reason? We all have different preferences about how church should go and how church should play out. But hear me, God's call on us as believers, for us as Christians who go to church is not that we don't have preferences, it's that we make sure we manage our preferences with the priority of unity. God's call for us as Christians is not to always fight to get our way in every situation. God's call for us as Christians is in every situation we prioritize unity. Daniel, are you telling me there's never a reason to leave a church? There are definitely reasons to leave a church. But listen, the reasons to leave a church have everything to do with orthodoxy and doctrine and mission moving forward. And if a church is hitting those things and you have some problems with preferences, your call, your job, my job is to prioritize unity over my preferences. Sometimes I think people see someone like me or someone like Pastor Keith and they think, well, it's just the Daniel show. I lead the young adult ministry here. Daniel just gets to call whatever shots he wants to at the Commons. Keith leads Grace Fellowship. He gets to do whatever he wants to at Grace Fellowship. Listen, even the leaders of our church are called to prioritize unity over their preferences. I don't get to do whatever I want at the Commons. Keith doesn't get to do whatever he wants at Grace Fellowship. There are times where we would prefer things to go a certain way and we have to just fight for unity because everybody else thinks it's better. Or the leaders have said something specific. There's so much we could dig into this conversation. And to be honest, this is one of those that I feel deeply in my soul. Because I see it with young adults and other pastors see it all the time at our church. I have conversation after conversation after conversation with people who come up to me and say, Daniel, I'm disappointed with Grace Fellowship. I'm thinking about leaving. And when I process through that with them, I always want to hear them out. I always want to make sure I'm kind. I want to make sure I speak the truth in love and I'm gentle in those conversations. But you would be amazed the amount of times someone comes to me and says, Daniel, I'm going to leave Grace Fellowship and here's why. And they tell me a preference that they have. I'm going to leave Grace Fellowship because the music's too loud. Okay? I'm going to leave Grace Fellowship because my small group's too big. I'm going to leave Grace Fellowship because I don't like the preaching style. Okay. Not wrong that you have those preferences. Not wrong at all. But have you prioritized unity? Or maybe have you made your preference take a higher place on the rung of your filter for what church is supposed to be? Come on. There are times when leaving a church is appropriate. But we are called as Christians to make sure we prioritize unity over our preferences. That's our part to play in the progress of the church moving forward. Now, the last one I want to just give to us real quickly and then we'll wrap up. The last thing that I think we're called to from this text to make sure that we're doing our part to move the church of Jesus forward is this phrase right here, that we would be a contributor, not a consumer. That we would be a contributor, not a consumer. This is wrapped up in the last phrase of the passage that we read, that we would do our part, that we would make sure that we are making our efforts to move the church forward. I think for a lot of us who struggle with this conversation, church has become a place of observing, of grading, of evaluating, but not owning. And our filter for what is a good church is, if I get out of it what I put in. Or if I go to a church and it makes me feel good while I'm there, it's going to be okay. But listen, God's call for those of us who go to a church, those of us who connect to a church, those of us who are going to engage a church, is not that we would just sit there and be consumers, but at the end of the day that we would be contributors, that we would play our part in moving the church towards the maturing thing that God has called it to be. The church is a work in progress, which means there is work to be done, which means we need to own our piece. We need to contribute. There are two mentalities when people go to a park and they see trash everywhere at the park. One person walks to that park and they say, man, what a shame. These people are just trying to enjoy themselves. They're trying to have a nice day in the park, and there's all this trash everywhere. There's another mentality that shows up at the same park, sees the same trash, and says the same thing. What a shame. There's all this trash everywhere. People are trying to enjoy their day, and then they pick up a trash bag, and they start to actually clean up the park. God's call for us is when we see in our church, when you see at Grace Fellowship areas where the church needs to grow, areas where the church needs to move forward, you wouldn't sit back and complain about it. You would actually contribute to be part of the problem or part of the solution to the problem. We would do our work. We would play our part. Now, here's what we need to just say about contributors. Contributors don't just go out on like rogue and do whatever they want to try and move the church forward and really just fight for their preferences. Contributors work within the system of a local church to make sure they're playing their part. So if a church tells you at Grace Fellowship, when we tell you part of being here at Grace Fellowship and being an owner and really contributing is you get in a group, you get in a group. Part of contributing to a local church is giving financially, you give financially. Oh, here's a crazy one. When you walk into the parking lot and you see trash out in the parking lot, oh my gosh, is he gonna tell me I need to pick up that trash and take it home with me? You go out in the parking lot, you grab the trash, you take it home with you and you throw it away. Someone's gotta do it. The church has to move forward. The church has to become more mature, and we are called to play our part. When you go and you pick up your kid and you see, man, the kids area is swamped. You don't go out to your car and then complain about it for 45 minutes while you sit in the parking lot. That was a parking lot joke. Instead, you say, man, maybe the kids area could use some help. And I have some gifting in that area. Maybe I sign up to volunteer. The perfect church does not yet exist. The perfect church is a work in progress, and we have a part to play in that progress. So we will be contributors, not consumers. I want to give you an action step, a homework assignment. We've been talking a lot about the work that we're supposed to do. The work that as Christians we are supposed to engage as we move the church forward to become what God wants it to become. And here's what I want your homework assignment to be this week. That at some point this week you would check your work. At some point this week you would reflect on your own life and your own engagement in the local church. And you would pause and you would say, man, do I even really believe that the church is a work in progress? And if I believe that it's a work in progress, have I done the work that God has called me to? Maybe you right now have some relational tension in your life with someone within the church that you need to address. You need to respond. You need to either go speak the truth in love, or you need to demonstrate some of those characteristics, or here's the crazy thing. Maybe you're the one causing relational tension and you need to own your peace and go apologize. Maybe for some of us, we've elevated one of our preferences and we haven't prioritized unity, and we're contemplating like, man, maybe Grace Fellowship isn't the right church because I have this preference that's not getting met, and you need to go back and you need to manage your preferences with the priority of unity. Or maybe you've just been a consumer here at Grace for a long time. You come in, you sit down, you engage the service, maybe you go to group, maybe you don't go to group. You need to start contributing in some way. This week, will you check your work? And I'll do the same. When we start talking about work and progress and effort and all those words, those action verbs, sometimes we have to ask the question, Daniel, is it really worth it? Like, is all that effort that it's going to take to be part of a church, to be part of the progress that God would maybe call the church to, is it worth it? I alluded earlier, I've been at Grace Fellowship for 26 years. I would venture to guess that I've been at Grace Fellowship longer than anybody in this room. I grew up here, went to kids ministry here, went to junior high ministry here, went to high school ministry here, was part of the young adult ministry for a little while, been on staff now for 5 years. I got married to someone that went to this church by a pastor who's on staff at this church. My parents are connected, my in-laws are connected to this church. I'm raising my kid here at this church. And can I just tell you that not only am God's calling. He says, pay attention to what Daniel's about to say. No, I'm just kidding. Not only am I a better Christian today than I was 26 years ago when I started here at Grace Fellowship, I'm a better man than I am today because of my involvement here at Grace Fellowship. I am in part the husband to my wife that I am today because of my involvement here at Grace Fellowship. And listen to me clearly. You might look at me and say, Daniel, yeah, you're the poster boy. You've seen all the good stuff. You've gotten all the treatment, blah, blah, blah. I've been here 26 years. I've seen our warts. I've seen the terrible seasons of Grace Fellowship. I've had people say things to me that were incredibly insensitive. I've been to this church. I've been through the tension. I've been through the struggle. I've been through the hard thing. And listen to me clearly. It is so worth the effort. It is so worth the progress. It is so worth every ounce of work that I have put in to make this church more mature. It benefits my life. It benefits my family. It benefits every aspect of my life. Listen, not because Grace is some cool spot to be part of the community at, because Grace is on mission to be the church that God has called her to be. And the gates of hell will not prevail over God's church. There is no amount of effort that is too much, that is too big of an ask. God's call for us is that we would be part of the progress, that we wouldn't jump ship the moment we get disappointed, that we wouldn't believe that the perfect church is out there, and when a church messes up, I bounce. We believe that the perfect church is a work in progress. And my story, my testimony is a testament to the fact that I've seen Grace Fellowship become a better church. Grace Fellowship is a far better church than it was 26 years ago. I'm a far better man than I was 26 years ago. I was also a baby when I was 26 years ago, but you know. And I believe your connection to this church is making you a better person, making you a better disciple, making you a better follower of Jesus. So would you own your peace, play your part? And by the way, here's the last note that I want to make sure we leave with. God will perfect his church. What we experience today is a half-baked version of the thing that God is ultimately leading to maturity. Not only is Grace Fellowship going to become a perfect church someday when God comes back, every church everywhere will become a perfect church. Because God will finish the work that he started. And right now, the work that he started is on us. We have to believe the perfect church is a work in progress. Let's pray together. Father God, I'm so grateful for this church. God, my 26 years here at Grace have been life-changing for me. I came to know you and form a relationship with you in this place. I met my spouse in this place. I'm raising my son in this place. And Father, I pray more than anything that I would not grow weary in doing my part. That I would make sure that I'm contributing and not consuming. That I wouldn't prioritize my preferences and that I would respond to relational tension appropriately. Father, I pray for every person at Grace Fellowship this weekend. If this is their first time, if this is their millionth time, that they would recognize that there is no perfect church, but Father, Grace Fellowship is a great one. And you have called us to be a part of the progress that you are making in this church becoming more mature. Father, would we reflect on our own life this week and recognize that maybe there's some work that we need to do that we're not currently doing, but Father, always allow us to have the mindset and the filter that says, you are coming back, you will complete your work, and the church will be perfected. Father, help us look forward to that day when there is no more strife, there is no more tension, there is no more dysfunction in the church, that you reign on your throne and it is perfect and the work is complete. Father, help us look forward to that day and to strive to be part of the progress. Father, it's in your name we pray. Amen.